My name's Jasper Ludwig. I'm a lecturer here at the School of Architecture and Built Environment at the University of Newcastle. I would like to begin the session today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country on which I'm situated, on which our campus in Callaghan is situated, the Pumbalong people of the Awabakal Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We are, I think, very lucky to be hearing from Nicole Gurran today, who joins us, I imagine, from Gadigal country in Sydney, where she holds the position of Chair of Urbanism at the University of Sydney, and where she teaches in the urban planning degrees, and in fact, where I first encountered Nicole's work, and especially her research. And this research is particularly interesting for us as part of this stream, which I'll speak about in a second, because it's concerned, I would say, with how housing connects to, I guess, broader aspects of urban but also economic policy. And I think, well, I mean, I hope that what we're going to be hearing from Nicole will sound a lot like a provocation to architects, especially students of architecture, and especially insofar as architects believe that they're able to affect change in Australia's housing market. And that's a provocation that I don't think architects can ever hear too often. Just to be clear, the lecture today is part of what we call our Visiting Architects and Experts program here at the School of Architecture and Built Environment. And more specifically, it's part of a stream within that program, a stream that's called Radical Domesticities. And that's in its second year now, and it's kind of broadly dedicated, I guess, to questions of housing policy, but also alternative models of ownership, and in particular this year, questions of financialization and debt, and architecture's relationship to financialization and debt. I'm showing you here the homepage of the Visiting Architects and Experts program, and I'd encourage everyone to have a look. There are a lot of events happening this semester. There are more happening tomorrow. So check it soon and then check it regularly, because there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out in the months ahead that's available to everyone. But today, I just briefly wanted to end by saying that I recently heard Nicole speak at the Rothwell Symposium at Sydney Uni earlier in the year, where she was speaking about, among other things, speaking about the history of social housing in Sydney. And I was really struck by the clarity with which Nicole was able to relate that history to our current housing affordability crisis, but also the way that she located the agency of architecture within that crisis. And so that's more or less the reason that Nicole is here, because that's her expertise. And I'm really, really looking forward to hearing about a similar set of ideas today. Thank you ever so much, Nicole, for being here. I'll hand over to you and just mention to everyone that keep the questions coming in the chat, even if I'm not putting them to Nicole immediately. We'll definitely make time at the end to work through them, as I know a lot of you are very interested in this material.
Thank you very much, Jasper, for the invitation to be part of this really wonderful sounding series. And before I say anything further, let me acknowledge that, yes, I am coming to you from unceded Gadigal land, and I pay my respects to the elders and traditional custodians of that land, and to elders past, present and emerging. And I extend those respects to any Aboriginal people who might be part of the class today. Okay, yes, so starting off with what I understand to be the framing of this particular series, I thought I'd basically try and explain the Australian housing story to you. I'm not sure so much that I can interpret it from an architectural perspective because I'm an urban planner. I still practice as well as being a researcher, and all of my research has been in the urban planning and in the housing space. But what I thought would be useful is to share with you the knowledge of how the housing system, how the housing market operates, and that might be an entrance point for you to start to engage with what the role of architects and architecture might be within that system. But I thought we should start off with what financialisation is, and maybe the architects and the people that you talk to are totally on top of this term, but I can promise you that the housing research community certainly isn't. There's a bit of debate about it, and the housing policy community, I'm not sure that they've even encountered it. But essentially, I'm going to boil it down, not even giving you references, but if you need references, Jasper, obviously I can send through a reference list. But if we boil it down, when I talk about the financialisation of housing, I'm talking about the transformation of housing, which was always an economic asset. Housing has always been an economic good. For most of us, housing is our most expensive, item in the household budget, be it our rent or our mortgage. And for those of us who are purchasing or own our own homes, it's often our biggest asset. So housing's always had an economic meaning. But it's been transformed under the sort of wave of political economic change that hit the world since the sort of 1970s. It's been transformed into a globally tradable asset, which is incredible when you think about it, because homes are fixed in space. It's not like, a house in Ireland can satisfy our need for a place to live in Sydney. And yet they can, houses somehow through financialisation have been transformed into this asset that allows us to globally trade in or invest in houses. So under financialisation, we've come to value homes more for their investment value, for their value as a source of equity, but also as a source of leverage. People can borrow against housing to buy more housing, as well as, of course, income. Now, housing's always provided a bit of income if you've been a landlord, of course, but that's grown. And particularly in the past 40 or 50 years, a great source of capital gain. Really, according to economists and people who study economic inequality, property-related inequality rather than wage-related inequalities become kind of the dominant paradigm of our time. And so we've seen in countries like Australia, but also in other countries, and it looks differently in different countries around the world, we've seen the rise of investors who dominate housing markets over owner investors. And I'll show you what that looks like in Australia in a moment. In Australia, we've had much more, believe it or not, individual investors in our housing stock, but in other countries, when they talk about financialisation, they're actually often worried about institutional investors. It doesn't really matter. It's just investment in housing. And we also see other types of markets, so financial markets, becoming intertwined with the housing market. So it's become associated with a rising demand for residential real estate, which essentially, when people talk about demand for housing, they don't actually mean the fact that people like you or I need houses to live in. My kids are going to need houses to live in. Demand actually just means price, because that's the signal, that's the way that demand is expressed. So financialisation has been associated with tremendous house price inflation. People demanded it because you can make more money from it, which in turn has meant barriers to first home ownership, because if you're already in the market, you're right, because your asset is growing along with the demand for housing generally. But those who aren't in experience those barriers to first home ownership, and so we see the rise of generation rent, again not unique to Australia. And throughout the world as well, over that past 40, 50 years since the 70s, we've seen the withdrawal of the welfare state from things like public housing. So in that sector as well, we've seen a marketisation. And this crashes, as I said before, there's that intersection between the housing market and financial markets, and sort of crashes with things like the global financial crisis, not caused by a collapse in the housing market, but caused by a collapse in the mortgage market, which led to a collapse in access to finance housing investment, which in turn, led to economic disaster and ruin throughout the world. Anyway, let's dive in. So what I wanted to do with that sort of preface of financialization, I've expressed what economists like to write, books and books and books about in 2 PowerPoint slides. So, if people listening are more on top of financialization than me, feel free to lift the level of discussion a little bit. But I think that's a reasonable working definition. So what I want to do now in about 20 minutes or so is give you a really short history of Australian housing, and we're really only going to pick it up from sort of federations. It's not the real history of Australian housing, but colonial, and we'll focus mostly on sort of the 90s to where we are right now. And then I want to show you why I think we're in the problems that we are in now, and I'm going to talk about sort of 3 aspects of our politics of housing policy in Australia, which make it so hard to really deal with the problems that we face. And I should say what I think the real problem that we face in Australia, the real housing problem that we face in Australia, is one of unequal housing wealth. And it's really the people who really face the housing problems that we should be focusing on are low and moderate income renters. So people who, it's not a problem faced by homeowners in the main, it's aspiring homeowners and low and moderate income renters. That's where the problem is. And then we'll talk about some alternatives. And I'm really just going to sketch out some alternatives. That's something that you might want to push me on more. We might want to have some conversation about at the end. Sorry. Okay, so let's pick up the history of Australian housing around about the turn of the last century, when housing and urban planning, because I'm an urban planner, so this is an exciting creation story for me. This was a time when we believed that urban planning and housing policy should work hand in hand to improve the housing conditions of the urban poor through better housing and through minimum standards on things like access to sunlight, ventilation, good plumbing, separation between buildings for fire safety, to prevent the spread of disease, and also, for basic urban amenity. Now that translated into some awful things like slum clearance, which cleared communities as well as bad housing. But it was representative of a time when there was a real belief that regulation and policy could lead to better quality urban and housing outcomes. You can see really the concern around public health and poor housing and overcrowded housing. I mean, the language is different, but this is the type of thing that worries us right now. When I look at a map of overcrowding in Sydney, or when I hear on the news that essential workers are bringing, COVID back home to their households, I am looking at the work that my research team have done on large households living in small rented apartments, on share households, on nurses and teachers who can't afford a home or a unit of their own to rent, let alone to purchase. So the same kinds of public health issues that existed 100 years ago, and that we were able to actually forget as a public policy, as a housing policy, or as an urban policy issue, because we had disease, literally under control. So it's now that the problems in our housing market and our housing system have actually got so bad that they're also public health problems once again. Anyway, 1945 straight after the Second World War, we had a real shortage of houses. Actually, around the world, there was a shortage of houses because the war effort, materials and labour had been diverted to the war effort. There'd been a massive depression before that time. And of course, there was a massive baby boom in the post-war era. So there was a real supply shortage. And the way to address that underlying housing need was for the government to step in with some significant policy and funding support at the Commonwealth level. And we saw the first Commonwealth State Housing Agreement, which again was about housing policy as well as planning policy. And the Commonwealth gave cheap loans to the states to finance public housing, which was to provide an alternative to the working class, essentially, provide a safe stepping stone into home ownership, but also to actually roll out the homes that the population needed. We also saw houses built for returning soldiers, for instance, also by public works agencies. And things bubbled along. The private sector, actually the Australian housing industry itself, developers and in fact some architects working with mass housing providers as well, mass housing developers, I guess you'd say, the private sector actually also kicked into action. And that's when we started to see rapid house building by the private sector too. And so by the early 70s, that housing shortage was well and truly under control, mostly actually by private sector effort at the end of the day, though there had been a really strong effort by the public sector in terms of house building for public housing and returned soldiers as well. So we had home ownership reaching around 70%, so from under 50% to around 70% by the early 70s. And the private rental market was operating as it should, as a place where you move when you leave the family home and you're sort of starting out on your working life, and it's the sector that you live in before you move into your own home sort of household formation stage and you move into home ownership. That was kind of how the private rental sector function with public housing. There we go. With public housing sort of there as a safety net, but also as a bit of a platform for people while they saved up to move into home ownership. So the winds of change happened around the 70s, but we weren't really conscious of it because there was still a reasonable amount of public house building still occurring. But the big shift was this idea that if you were going to access public housing, it was a form of welfare rather than a genuine housing choice for anyone who preferred to have long-term tenure and was happy to be housed within the public housing system. There began a sense, this is welfare assistance for the poor. And so this idea that it's actually part of the housing system began to fade away. By the 80s, I'm going to move really fast now. By the 80s, we started to play around a little bit with the way that we tax housing, but also incentivised investment in property. And so there was a bit of a playing around with some of the taxation settings applying to housing and a capital gains tax, which essentially means if you make a profit on any asset, incidentally, you have to pay capital gains in that financial year. It was introduced to property. The family home was exempted, but investment properties attracted that tax. And then it was halved around about this period. There was some flirtations around negative gearing. Negative gearing existed, but there wasn't really a massive sort of emphasis on investing in real estate. So it was in the landscape, but it wasn't the thing that it became. In any case, there was still a strong real estate lobby around at that time, so it was reintroduced. And we started to see a shift as well from investing in public rental housing to providing a rental subsidy through Commonwealth rent assistance. So this is subsidising renters in the very, very low income renters in the private market rather than building new public housing. Now, I've put in brackets down the bottom some things that were bubbling away. And again, we weren't really conscious of the way that they were changing our housing system. One of them was financial deregulation. So we started to see the non-bank lenders. Now, I remember as a 12-year-old going into the bank with my mum. She was a single parent and she was working as a teacher, and she wanted to get a home loan to purchase her own house. And the bank would not lend to her because she was a woman. She had a choice of 3 banks. I can't remember who they were. There's definitely the Commonwealth Bank. I can't remember who the others were. And they wouldn't lend to her because she was a woman. And, who's to say she was going to stay in her job? What would happen when she got married was what the bank manager said to her. And a year or so later, she managed to get a home loan from a building society. But it was when the non-bank lenders started to come in. Actually, there was greater access to finance, which was a great thing because it allowed people to enter home ownership, people for whom they might not have been able to enter home ownership before. But when finance is available, it means people can spend more on housing as well. So that this was bubbling away, muted at the time because of higher interest rates, but it was there. The other thing that happened was a step change in how much money people could pay for housing, and that was women entering the workforce. So you start to double household income. And the things that drive housing demand are access to finance and household income and wage growth. So you've got these things happening ready for it to start to be tipped into property. And remember some of these tax reforms as well, providing some incentives as well for people to invest in property. Anyway, let's leave them over there. We'll pick up the 90s, which is when sort of the mid-90s, the late 90s is when I graduated as an urban planner. I started to work for the state government in a housing job. My first job actually was working with public housing tenants. But it was quite an exciting time because we had on the table a national housing strategy, which had been led by a Labor government at the Commonwealth level. It was never adopted, but, we hadn't given up hope at that point in time. There was talk about shifting from public housing, which had its problems. It was a monolithic state landlord, very inflexible, some horrific stories about public housing tenants experiencing stigma, neglect of their property, living in concentrated estates that were, dilapidated, and also increasingly you had to be in such dire need even to qualify for public housing, which was seen as welfare that needed to be rationed. And so this idea that maybe local community-based community housing providers could provide a better housing experience, even if access to that, to the social housing sector was going to be limited. This idea that in social housing, not just government providers, but community-based providers who could, really respond to the needs of their tenants. This was, the type of reform that was occurring at the time. Counter to that was also this belief that actually the market was the place to solve housing problems. And by that, it meant if governments could move out of the space, why should government? This was the rhetoric, and the rhetoric still exists. It's believed, many people believe this very strongly. And in fact, most of the commentators that write in the newspaper, including, many of our very, very good economic commentators, but they strongly believe that the housing market, because they believe that markets are self-correcting, and they have a view that the housing market can self-correct itself as well, and therefore government should be moving out of the way. It shouldn't be in the business of providing housing such as public housing. It should be looking at how to free up the market to solve problems like house price inflation or high rents. I hope you'll ask me more about this later, because I don't want to go down too much of a rabbit warren. We'll just leave that there. So there's this emphasis on market solutions, and what we call the residualisation of public housing, which simply means only the poorest of the poor with the most complex needs and multiple disadvantages were able to access public housing. So it's contributed to this sense that it was a problematic form of housing, unfairly seen as a really problematic, stigmatised housing of last resort. And I've put at the bottom, again, what was bubbling on in the market was the arrival of non-bank lenders, some innovation in the housing space. So people could actually use their house as an ATM. They had these equity loans. You don't hear about them so much anymore, but in the 90s, when house prices were starting to go up, people looked at the hypothetical value of their homes, and the bank said, we'll lend you money. You can take money out against that value of your home. So people were able to highly leverage even against the property, against the house themselves. So really, really reinforcing this notion of house as a financial asset. And we saw with economic growth, after the recession of the 90s, we saw with economic growth, house price inflation, which is, what we're seeing today as well. But there was a real boom between 96 to 2003, and we haven't really had a bust since 2003. We've had a few other booms since then. But it was during that period, so from the early 2000s on, that house prices started to separate house price growth started to separate from income growth. Until that time, price growth and wage growth had kind of, kept in track, but, they're separated about that time. And we had a whole series of government inquiries about barriers into first home ownership. We started to see real rhetoric around, is it supply? Is it that the market's not allowed to produce enough housing supply? We saw the global financial crisis, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, and a brief intervention by the Commonwealth Government back into public housing following that financial crisis, built 20,000 new social housing dwellings. That was it. Since that time, we've seen falling home ownership and rising property prices, which you're all very familiar with. And so this is what's happened to housing tenure. Essentially, we've started to fall from 70% home ownership, where we were for about 20 years, to around about 65% of people in home ownership, much lower in younger generations, and rising numbers of people in the private rental sector. So our funding for social housing has stayed about the same in dollar terms as it was in the mid-90s, failing to keep up with need. We've got less than 4% of households now living in public housing. There's been an idea that you renew that public housing, but only in the context of a highly financialised form of renewal. So it's a real estate redevelopment with the idea that the private market can fund just the rehabilitation of that public housing, not the expansion, not increasing the supply of it, but just perhaps diluting the concentration of public housing units by adding in market units. And a rising rental subsidy, but it's not actually alleviating the affordability problems that very low income renters face. And for people in the private rental market, very few protections in terms of, you can be evicted within, once your 6-month or your 12-month lease is up, you can be evicted, for any reason. The quality, your ability to require quality in your rental housing, to require repairs is limited, and so on. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. Now, I'm not going to go through these, but I just thought it would be useful for you to get a sense of what the Commonwealth and the states are doing in relation to housing assistance. Around about 800,000 households nationwide are able to access social housing. So it's a tiny part of the housing system now in Australia, compared to in Europe, still around 30% to In Hong Kong, we've got 50% of households living in some form of social housing, nearly 50%. Singapore, 80% live in public housing, including homes that they own, but that were produced by a public housing program. And another 1.3 million households receiving rental assistance. So that's it. It's pretty small given the amount of need. Massive waiting lists of more than 10 years. Okay, so let's just talk about the politics of housing policy. Jasper, how am I going for time?
It's past.
Okay, and you want to finish at 4?
I'm open, whatever.
Okay.
I think we should let the material determine the time.
All right, I'll try and finish my bit within about 15 minutes or so.
Sure.
I think I'm nearly there. But is there anything that anyone wants to clarify?
I won't. I mean, people should speak for themselves, but in terms of the chat, not yet. I think we can hold those questions till the end.
Okay. All right, let's keep going.
Thanks,
Jasper. All right, so look, there's 3 politics of housing policy that I want to explain in terms of why we sort of allowed that problem, to emerge. And the first that we have to come to grips with in Australia is we have very foundational colonial assumptions about land, about property, and about real estate. And really, Australia has been founded on land speculation and making money from speculation around land development. That has fed into a very powerful politics of property. And we started off with talking about housing as a financialised asset. So that origin story has only become all the stronger as land itself has risen as a globalised asset and valued and celebrated for its financial value rather than its use value. And that's why we see things like, in the context of the government wanting to provide economic stimulus to the economy, rather than supporting, for instance, new social housing construction, or even, providing access to affordable rents to renters in distress, you see $25,000 cash grants given to property owners for renovations, or people who are able to enter into a large building contract with a builder for their first home. That we're talking $750,000, and we see $25,000 cash grants to them. So we're prioritising the rights of property owners over residents because of this politics of property. And of course, behind this politics of property is a really strong industry, what would you call it? Ecology, if you like. Now, Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, was actually the research director for the Property Council of Australia, which has a budget of over $25 million per year to spend on, research. I mean, to give you a sense of proportion, the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, the independent research body that provides housing research, has about $2 million per year to spend on peer-reviewed research. The Property Council is spending, 12 times that on research. It's not peer-reviewed, but on material to push their agenda. And so, we saw that very, very powerful defence of negative gearing in the context of the last election, which now has, risen again very briefly, with the Labor Party saying, well, that's okay, we're not going to touch negative gearing in this election because, we think it might have cost us government in the last election. But Property Council, for instance, and the real estate industry, we're sending out fake eviction notices to renters, telling them that on behalf of renters and housing affordability, negative gearing, needed to be preserved, which of course was nonsense. But it was all about, we protect property investment. But the reason that that arguments like this from the property council and the real estate industry and others, the reason why they're so powerful is because we actually do have a much wider in Australia economic dependence on property wealth, and we've got to face this front and centre. So around about 8 to 10% of all jobs in Australia in the construction sector. Obviously, some of your jobs, as architects, are going to be in that bundle as well. But that's really important. So when the global financial crisis hit, for instance, countries that had been having a massive building boom like Ireland, all of a sudden wiped out 10% of their employment, in one hit. So you can understand why governments actually are so prickly and so concerned to protect private sector construction, particularly given that 99% of all homes are produced in the private sector. Then, of course, the property market is a great source of government revenue, both through stamp duty in particular, so on the taxes that they collect when houses are bought and sold, when real estate is bought and sold, which has been growing and growing for state governments, and also capital gains tax, of course, for the Commonwealth government. But more important, again, is the sense of consumer confidence. So when homeowners, and we've still got 65% of households living in their own homes, so that's the majority, they feel very unwilling to go and spend money in the economy if they think that the value of their home is going down. But when they feel the value of their home is rising, then, they're really confident to go to Harvey Norman and, splash out money here, there and everywhere. So it's actually, this consumer confidence associated with home ownership and, property prices rising is actually one of the pillars of the economy. And we haven't worked out how to unwind it. So instead of attacking those things front on, we've had politicians fall into this misdiagnosis of housing problems as a supply shortage, which is great, because if it's a supply shortage, that means that the answer is to build more houses, which, 10% of the economy building more houses, jobs in the economy, keep that supply, myth alive, and you've got that sector of the economy chugging along, is pretty much where we're at. But politicians know that you still have to act a little bit concerned, because you've got now 30% and rising of your potential voters who are hurting. So you've got your renters and the mums and dads who are wondering when their kids are going to leave home. So you have to perform a little bit of concern. And so you prescribe something that ideologically you're opposed to, which is government intervention, through urban regulation. But also by prescribing, a reform to things like urban land use planning, it's not actually going to do anything in any case. So we hear arguments around releasing supply by rezoning rural land or reducing design expectations around our housing quality. And usually those design expectations are around things like apartment size, access to sunlight, public space, communal space, setbacks from the street, the environmental qualities that are embedded into design, and so on. Look, this is, I've got as much evidence as you want about politicians saying, the problem, it's not financialisation, it's not the tax system, it's not negative gearing, it's not that we're not paying for public housing, it's urban planning. And, just last week, yet another inquiry into this idea of regulatory restrictions was announced, and, we're all set to run through all of these arguments yet again. When we look at what's changed in terms of housing construction in Australia, new housing supply, the thing that's changed is this. Public sector house building was around It reached around 12% of all new houses being produced in Australia in the mid-80s to the 90s, and that's dropped to around 1% now. So if we've got a supply problem, it's that the government's not involved in building houses. But actually overall, dwelling production has trended up. But let me just show you a couple more graphs. Sorry, I'll just go back to here. But, you know, if ever you needed an answer as to the impact of financialisation and its relationship to supply, what we see in Australia is as prices rise, so does production. So we actually do have a very responsive housing market. It's just that it's addicted to price rises to produce more homes. So, you know, the industry is not stupid. They're not going to produce more homes when prices are flatlining. The only way to produce more houses when prices do flatline is through the public sector and the production of public and social housing. But this is not going to resolve the problem that I diagnosed right at the beginning, which is housing affordability for very low income renters and those trying to get into the housing market. This is just showing you the real driver of house prices, you know, over the past, nearly 2 decades, and that is as interest rates fall, house prices rise. Yeah. And this is just to show you the financialisation of Australia's housing system. So in the 80s, you know, when I went, pretty much a year after I went with my mum to see if she could get a home loan, the market at that point was dominated by owner-occupiers. So in the mid-80s, 90% of homeowners went to people financing their own home. By 30 years later, 2015, you had nearly 50% of home loans going to investors. So these are landlords. You know, so that's, you know, it's just a graph showing this is the actual financialisation of Australia's housing system. Now that departed a little bit because we started to see some restrictions put in on the amount that investors could borrow. So that actually allowed some owner-occupiers, you know, back into the market. And that's danced around a little bit since then. But we'll never see this again unless we really, you know, change the way that we approach housing policy in Australia. This is a summary. I thought I'd leave you with this, so I'll send this over to you, Jasper, but it just shows you, you know, what we're doing. We're helping around 60,000 of our 120,000 known homeless people. There's a lot more hidden homeless. So out of the housing problems, we're actually not helping them very much. The people, the biggest amount of support is actually going in negative gearing. So 2.4 million plus private landlords are getting the bulk of the support. So we've got nearly 1 million, nearly 2 million, just a little bit over 2 million people in housing need getting some assistance, but more than that, again, of private landlords receiving assistance in the form of negative gearing. These are a little bit complex, so I won't talk through those, but let's get to some alternatives just for, you know, a bright thing to talk about. So I've got 4 or 5 things that I think would structurally change our housing system. And the first one, of course, is to redirect resources to new construction and social housing. So we want to move from 2% of new houses and, you know, 4% of the housing system to a much healthier sector of housing production being built by non-profit, social, community or public housing providers. And they're able to operate counter-cyclically. They don't actually even affect real estate values. So house prices can continue to rise. They're certainly not going to moderate, but they build homes in response to housing need. Absolutely not a financialised response to housing. Government has to subsidise upfront construction for housing for people who are on very low incomes, and they provide some rental subsidy that already exists, and they would support social housing providers by providing access to low-cost loans, low-cost finance. The second one is around negative gearing. Look, we wouldn't have solved the problem if the Labor Party had continued its platform of negative gearing and succeeded. It wouldn't have solved it. It would have been a fairer housing policy, and it would have reduced the unfair competition that first home buyers face when they're competing against landlords. It wouldn't have solved the problem. But we should be saying, in response to that tax subsidy, we should be requiring landlords to provide long-term leases and, better still, provide affordable rents, and targeting those affordable rents to middle income earners who are missing out when in the rental market because of competition. We found during COVID that when you increase income support to people on very low incomes, to renters on very low income, they will often improve their housing. So that is a really good strategy. It's not something that architects are going to be able to do, but you should be advocating for low-income renters to have more financial support, because that financial support, in conjunction with better protections for renters, will improve the quality of the rental stock, and it will allow people to access better housing. So that's an important thing to do. This is part of the area where architects and designers can start to support, and this is around really building a non-profit and limited profit models that are accessible for people on any income whatsoever. So they're things like deliberative housing development, which is where groups of people get together. They might commission an architect, for instance. They've got a site and they collectively build a development that they all put money into. They're not trying to make money out of it. They want to live in this property. There's no developer, so it's not so you limit the development margin, and you get an outcome that is a high quality housing outcome. Community land trusts, where people share in the land and own the house. Again, it's really a non-financialized housing alternative that provides a long-term housing solution with great, security for the people who are part of that trust. Not operational yet in Australia, but the sort of thing that people can advocate for. And cooperatives, housing cooperatives, are a version of this. Really wonderful, inspiring models from Europe. All of the European housing cooperatives are strongly supported by government policy, and they're underpinned by, the most wonderful design as well. So in conclusion, our financialised housing system has absolutely led to a deepening inequality based on access to housing wealth. The structural solutions to that inequality are about increasing the size of the non-profit and the limited profit sector of the housing system. So actually tipping the balance from, the financialised system to the non-financialised, sector of the housing system, if I can put it as simply as that, combined with income support and regulatory support for renters. So to leave with the provocation, design isn't the problem. So, you often hear people saying, oh, it's we need to shave off, gold-plated designs, we can't afford good design, or it's because, the expectations around, housing is too high, or equally that, if you just had an innovative design solution like prefabrication or this or that, and you could reduce the build cost, that would resolve housing affordability. It just won't. But it can play a part in some of the solutions if we can get the structural stuff right. But the reasons, the reason why I say design innovation isn't the solution that most of my students, hope it would be. It's because unless we've got a structural solution in place, lower cost production done correctly is still going to be priced very highly in our financialised housing market. So the savings are not going to be passed on to the lower income earners. That said, policy or regulation could restrict access, for instance, to those models, and so you could then start to pass on those savings, or so with some policy intervention combined with lower cost production, potentially there's a bit of a solution there. But the bottom line is actually that good design doesn't cost more to produce necessarily. It's just that it's valued more highly by the market. So we need to actually have more good design so that it's not so scarce in the market, and remain committed to providing better housing outcomes.